Thank you very much. Let me first explain the background of the whole intellectual enterprise, because I think this is very important. The whole, let's say, discipline or the whole school that I'm coming from is called comparative capitalism. It's a bit broader than the varieties of capitalism concept, but the latter is, of course, the most important and well-known. The basic idea is to compare capitalist systems on the national level. And the striking thing is that if you take a closer look at national economic systems, they're very different. For example, if you compare, which is a traditional comparison in the varieties of capitalism approach, Germany and the US, you will find out that, for example, in Germany, labor unions are extremely important and powerful. And we have a very specific system of training on the company level. If you go to the US, for example, labor unions are hardly important. Training takes place in other places. In the US, however, financial markets, for example, are very important. In the UK, financial markets are important. In Germany, again, financial markets are not important. So we have a strong degree of variety of national capitalist systems. And the idea of this academic enterprise is to single out some general models so that we don't have to discuss each country by country, but that we kind of say divide the world in 4, 5 different major types of capitalism. And we do so by a focus on comparative institutional advantage. So the argument is that certain models of capitalism lead to certain typical advantages. So the Germans, for example, have an advantage in machinery industry or luxury automobiles. The US has advantages in IT. And this is not by coincidence. There are certain institutional complementarities behind these institutional advantages. And the institutions we are looking at are corporate governance, how a company is governed, finance, where companies get their money from, industrial relations, which means the system between labor unions and companies, the education system, and the innovation system. Now, this normally works on a high level of abstraction. We try to group as many countries as possible to one type. So it really, in the original varieties of capitalism system, the whole world was put into 2 camps, coordinated and liberal capitalism. Then when we came up with the term of dependent capitalism, there was a third model. Now, I can tell that the invention of the term came from my first visit to Budapest, because when I was driving with a taxi from the airport to the city, I was struck by seeing so much commercial advertisements of German companies, some Austrian companies, but I was, of course, expecting lots of Hungarian companies, but I didn't see anyone. So I was really struck by this dominance of German and other Western European companies, and that triggered my interest into the economic system of countries like Budapest. Like Hungary, and it also stuck with me. There seems to be some kind of dependence on Western companies. Now, in a more general, more systematic way, in the years following years, this is something that is around some 15 years by now. We have looked into different types of capitalism in emerging economies. So my specialty is to look not, let's say, into German capitalism, although I like to do that as well, but rather into emerging economies, and to identify those emerging economies that have particularly high rates of growth. And there are 2 groups of countries, 2 types of capitalism in emerging economies that have been very successful over the last 15, 20 years. The one is the so-called dependent capitalism in the Visegrad region, and the other one is a so-called state-permeated capitalism in countries like China and India. Let me very briefly explain the background of these terms and the focus of these models before I give you some figures on this development. If you look at the dependent capitalism in the Visegrad region, it has a comparative institutional advantage on semi-standardized industrial goods such as cars. However, these cars are not being fundamentally developed in the region, but rather the region harbors assembly platforms, it harbors production facilities for car parts, and so on. The core innovation remains in the headquarters, the parts of the companies where you also make a lot of profit by branding cars and so on. Very often this is, for example, in Germany, but of course not limited to Germany. In the Visegrad region, in the dependent market economies, the focus is rather on assembly because wages are lower, but people are very skilled. And of course, there are innovations, but not, let's say, the development of whole new cars and brands and so on. The problem is that the dominance of these foreign companies limits the ability for independent economic strategies. For example, you have to offer these companies good conditions to attract foreign direct investment. So you have to be careful with taxes, or you think you have to be careful with raising taxes. And that, of course, limits, for example, the money you can spend on education, training, science, and the like. If we very quickly, which is not the main purpose today of my talk, to state-permitted capitalism in China, in India, they have a very different model. Of course, they also attract a lot of foreign direct investment, but as you will see in a minute, it's very limited in the context of their economic models. The focus in these economies is clearly on domestic demand. Although we think that China is a major export power, and of course it's important, Chinese exports are important in many economies. If you take a look at the Chinese economy, it's absolutely not export dependent. It has a strong share of domestic consumption, and the domestic market is way more important for Chinese companies than exports. Second, what is very striking, very different from these countries to the dependent market economies is that the countries' governments, both in China, but also in India and other countries following this model, put a strong focus on national control over economic policy. So they are very worried about giving up control to foreign companies, and they want to be able to shape their own future, to invest in technologies, to use domestic demand for their own companies. Let me illustrate these very abstract ideas now with a few figures that are all taken from a publication which is openly available from a journal in Warsaw in Poland. The first is exactly the point of departure for our whole debate, the high volume of FDI in the Visegrad region. Here you see the stock of FDI in a relationship to the size of the economy, and you see that the countries in the Visegrad region really stand out. If you compare this with India and China, on the other side, you see that FDI, although these countries are important destinations for FDI, is much less important there. And you can also see, for example, the case of Japan. Japan is also very careful with letting foreign companies in country. They want to keep control over their own economy, and therefore are very reluctant to allow FDI inward. The countries of the Visegrad region, in turn, are very open to FDI. They have about the lowest restrictions for FDI. This is an OECD measure for restrictions for foreign direct investment. And you see here that the Visegrad countries are among the most open countries in this regard. And the marked contrast is really to China and India, which are the most closed to FDI. So, of course, they allow FDI. They also attract a lot of FDI, but they only allow FDI according to their own rules. So you have to negotiate with the government, and you only are able to bring in FDI if you fulfill certain conditions, particularly technology transfer to domestic companies. And that's why the OECD considers these economies way more restrictive than the model of the Visegrad countries. So these are two very interesting comparative cases because they're both opened to the world economy roughly at the same time. They are also the two regions that have seen a very dynamic development in recent times, but the models they have chosen for integrating into global capitalism are completely different. Openness on the side of the Visegrad region, very strategic, very selective opening on the side of China and India. The same you can see with regard to protectionism. This is again an OECD indicator that gives you an idea how open the markets are. And you see again in China and India that they are rather protectionist. They keep their markets rather closed in order to maximize domestic demand for their own companies, whereas you can see in the Visegrad countries, they are as open as the other important Western economies. And therefore, of course, a lot of demand is being serviced by foreign companies. Another striking difference between these two types of emerging market capitalism is public control on the banking sector. The banking sector is very important if you want to control the fate of your economy, because if you have banks that are under public control, for example, like the German Kreditanstalt für Wiederaufbau, you have the ability to say, okay, from the state, well, we want, for example, focus on investments for climate protection in the years to come, and then you can offer specific credit terms for this and so on. As you can see in the state-permeated capitalism in China and India, the most important banks are under state control. So credit allocation is being controlled by the state. If you go to the Visegrad countries, only in Poland, you see a certain degree of state-controlled banks. But otherwise, the banking sector is mainly in external hands, is led by foreign banks. Although these figures, I think, are a bit outdated, I think the situation has changed over the last 10 years a bit. The most, let's say, worrisome figures are my last figures. They relate to the expenditures for research and development. And here, of course, you can imagine that expenditures for research and development are maybe lower than in Germany, Japan, or the US, which are leaders globally in many fields of technology development. But also a country like China now has a much higher share of expenditures in relation to, let's say, the size of the economy than in the Visegrad region. And if I would have more recent figures, which is always a bit difficult with Chinese statistics, let's say the figures for China would even be higher. So this is something that is very worrisome, because you're not able to develop your own technologies and your companies that have, let's say, the abilities like Chinese companies to become world leaders in technologies. So to wrap up with my presentation, the model of dependent capitalism has worked quite well in the past. If you look at GDP growth, for example, in Europe, the Visegrad region is doing an excellent job. Poland is, for example, the country with the highest growth rates over many years. If we look at distribution in country, it's a different story, because let's say the fruits of this growth are being very unevenly distributed in the countries. I also think that the model will remain quite stable for the next 5 to 10 years. The countries will gain a lot from the next generation EU funds. I think that Germany will relocate additional car production to the region, because Germany is phasing out combustion car production over the next years, and will relocate part of this production to the region, because German headquarters will rather focus on electric cars. And there will also be a tendency of nearshoring after the coronavirus pandemic, so that some, let's say, production facilities that currently are in East Asia may be relocated to Eastern Europe, maybe also to Southern Europe. So I think for the next years, this will remain stable. However, I'm quite worried about the long-term sustainability, because this model is difficult to operate with rising wages. So you can either have strongly rising wages or keep these facilities. Otherwise, they will move farther eastward, let's say to Romania. But even more worrisome, you are very much dependent on the fate of the headquarters of these companies. I'm not too optimistic for the German car producers in the long run, and for the German export sector anyway. I think it has seen let's say, the highlight of its expansion globally. So you may be caught in this maybe this demise of the German export model. And finally, let me highlight you again to this article where we coined this this term. So if you want to read this in more systematic way, and also this more recent figures where I have that I have used during my presentation. Thank you for your attention, and now I'm very much looking forward to Zoltan and the debate.